The winter fog clung to the broken pines like a shroud, as if the forest itself wished to hide from the cruelty of a war it had not asked to witness. And in the pale morning silence, a young American infantryman named Thomas Avery moved with the weary caution of someone who had already seen too much for his 23 years. He carried slung across his shoulder an old bolt-action rifle, a relic from another century, one his grandfather had brought back from the mud-choked trenches of the First World War. And though the metal was worn and the stock bore the scars of 2 generations, Thomas held it with reverence, as if the past were guiding his hands. His comrades had laughed the first day they saw it, calling it Grandpa's museum piece, a hunter's toy, a weapon that belonged in a dusty attic instead of on the battlefields of 1944. But Thomas only smiled and kept cleaning it, knowing there was something steady and unshakable in the simplicity of its parts, something that matched the quiet steadiness he had cultivated to keep himself alive. The platoon trudged forward through the Ardennes, their boots crunching the thin crust of frost that coated the ground. Rumors swirled of SS patrols sweeping the region with ruthless precision, men who moved like shadows and left only blood and silence in their wake. Thomas felt the weight of tension in the air as if the forest itself was its breath. Each step deeper into that labyrinth of trees and ghostly white branches felt like an invitation to fate. And yet, there was no choice but to continue. The war cared nothing for fear, and duty marched them forward, whether they were ready or not. The cold cut through their uniform, stiffening their fingers and slowing their breath, turning every movement into an effort of will. Snowflakes drifted lazily, indifferent to the suffering of men, settling upon helmets and rifle barrels like forgotten confetti from a distant celebration that no one remembered. Thomas walked slightly apart from the others, not by choice, but by temperament. He was not a loner, but there was something inward about him, something contemplative that made him linger in silence. He traced his thoughts as carefully as he traced the worn notches in the rifle stock, remembering how his grandfather had spoken of courage not as the willingness to charge into bullets, but as the inner quiet that allowed a man to act when everything inside him wanted to collapse. Sometimes, as he gripped the rifle, he felt as if those old words lingered like fingerprints on the steel, guiding him through the chaos around him. The forest grew darker as they approached a narrow ravine where the trees leaned inward, their branches knitting together overhead like the ribs of some ancient cathedral. The squad halted, hushed voices passing orders down the line. Scouts whispered of movement ahead, the kind that sent a chill down the spine even before confirmation. The sergeant raised a closed fist, signaling silence, and the men crouched low, hearts thudding like distant artillery. Thomas knelt beside a fallen log, eyes scanning the white-dusted undergrowth, his breath forming small clouds that vanished almost immediately. Then came the faint snap of a twig, followed by another, and an unnatural stillness settled over the squad, as though the forest itself had turned to stone. Thomas's heartbeat slowed into a heavy, rhythmic thrum. The sergeant mouthed the words, SS Patrol. Fear flickered through the men like a cold current. The stories of the SS preceded them everywhere they went. Relentless, merciless, surgically effective. There was something predatory in the deliberate cadence of their approach, something that made every soldier instinctively tighten his grip on his weapon. Thomas pressed his back against the icy bark of a tree and leveled his rifle, its wooden stock creaking faintly as he settled into position. He could already hear the whispers from weeks past, the good-natured teasing that had grown into amused disbelief every time they drilled. "That old thing won't save you, Avery. You'll be cycling that bolt while the rest of us are already firing our second magazine." He had never taken offense. The rifle was slow, yes, but it was honest, and it demanded calm, something Thomas had learned to summon even when the world around him felt like it was collapsing. Now, in the thick hush of the forest, calm was his only ally. The footsteps drew closer. Dark silhouettes emerged through the curtain of fog, their uniforms blacker than the surrounding shadows, their movements swift and organized. Thomas's breath slowed, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, and he felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a cloak. He thought of his grandfather's stories, of the men who had fought before him, of the strange inheritance of courage passed down through hands and decades. The squad around him shifted uneasily, but Thomas felt something different, something steady, something almost serene, as if time were narrowing to a single sharp point. The first SS soldier stepped into the clearing. Thomas exhaled once, softly, and the world constricted into the thin line of his rifle sight, the sound of his heartbeat, the cold metal beneath his cheek. What followed, though still moments away from erupting, was already etched into the bones of the forest, into the destiny that had drawn him here with an antique rifle and a legacy older than the war itself. The first shot broke the stillness, like a lightning strike through glass. A single echo rolled through the forest, sharp and clean, carrying with it the haunting finality of death. The lead SS man collapsed before he even hit the ground, his body folding in on itself as if the life had been neatly snuffed out by an unseen. The sound scattered birds from the upper branches, their wings a frantic flurry of white against the grey sky. Thomas's rifle bolt slid back with a metallic whisper, expelling a spent shell that spun in slow, glittering arcs before disappearing into the snow. He chambered the next round without haste, his movements deliberate, unhurried, guided by muscle memory older than fear itself. The second target fell before the rest even located the source of the attack. Panic rippled through the SS patrol like a living thing, a sudden fracture in their flawless formation. Shouts erupted in German, short, sharp, filled with disbelief that someone could hit them so precisely from within the trees. Thomas did not move from his position. He adjusted, breathed, and squeezed again. A third man dropped beside the first two, his rifle clattering uselessly against the frozen ground. Each shot was a punctuation mark in a sentence written by fate, and Thomas was the reluctant author. The squad around him had frozen in awe. The other Americans exchanged glances of astonishment, caught between terror and reverence. The rifle they had mocked for weeks now spoke with a voice of thunder and precision, cutting through the elite SS patrol as if it were enacting some old justice carved into the wood of its stock. One of his comrades whispered, "Jesus Christ, he's picking them off." The sergeant signaled for the men to hold position, unwilling to break the rhythm of something that seemed almost supernatural in its deadly calm. Thomas adjusted his stance, lining up another silhouette that flickered between the trees. He could hear the enemy scrambling for cover, their shouts dissolving into fragmented chaos. They fired wildly into the woods, muzzle flashes sparking like angry fireflies in the gloom. Splinters exploded near Thomas's face. A branch shattered inches from his head, but he didn't flinch. The bolt moved again, smooth as breath, and another shot roared out. The fourth SS soldier fell mid-step, spinning awkwardly before hitting the snow. For a moment, silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, charged with the weight of what has just transpired. Thomas's mind drifted back, unbidden, to his grandfather's stories of muddy trenches, gas masks, and the ceaseless rattle of machine guns. The old man's voice had always carried a soft tremor when he spoke of it, a haunted tone that only those who had seen the truth of war could possess. "A rifle's not just wood and metal," he had once said. "It's a memory, a promise. It remembers the hands that carried it, the men who trusted it." Now, crouched in the frost-bitten woods of Belgium, Thomas understood. His hands gripped the same worn leather sling that had crossed another man's shoulder 3 decades earlier, another man who had fought not for glory, but for the fragile idea of peace. Every pull of the trigger felt like an echo across time, a communion between generations of soldiers bound by the same cold fear and reluctant bravery. The SS regrouped quickly. They were trained, disciplined, lethal, but their precision could not undo the advantage Thomas held in invisibility and patience. He shifted to his left, crawling through the snow like a phantom, and found a new vantage point behind a moss-covered stump. The fifth man appeared, scanning the tree line, his breath visible in the frozen air. Thomas steadied himself once more, the rifle's iron sights aligning perfectly. Another shot, another collapse. The surviving SS shouted commands, their formation breaking down under invisible fire. They retreated toward a ridge, dragging their wounded, firing bursts into nothingness. The Americans seized the chance to reposition, the sergeant motioning for the men to flank, but Thomas stayed fixed in place, eyes locked, pulse steady. He could feel the end coming, like the slow closing of a curtain. He fired twice more, 2 flashes, 2 echoes, 2 more men down. The old rifle roared its defiance against modern war, against the arrogance of those who believed age meant weakness. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 SS soldiers lay motionless among the snow and pine needles. Thomas lowered the weapon slowly. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of what had just happened. Around him, the men emerged from their positions, eyes wide, silent in the face of what they had witnessed. The sergeant approached, his voice low with disbelief. You took them all." Thomas only nodded. The rifle rested against his chest, steam rising from its barrel, as if exhaling from the battle itself. In that moment, it felt not like a weapon, but like an heirloom that had fulfilled its destiny. The forest, once heavy with threat, now seemed to exhale as well, a deep and sorrowful sigh that carried through the pines. Far above, The snow began to fall again. Slow, quiet, forgiving. The forest had fallen back into silence, but it was a silence that hummed with ghosts. The smell of gunpowder clung to the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy and metallic, mingling with the faint scent of pine and blood. Thomas crouched beside the fallen tree, his breath ragged, eyes fixed on the thin ribbon of steam that still rose from the rifle's barrel. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, slow but relentless, each thud echoing the pulse of something ancient, something that transcended the single moment of combat he had just lived through. Around him, the others moved cautiously, stepping through the aftermath with that hesitant reverence soldiers develop after violence, an instinctive understanding that the ground they walked on had changed forever. The sergeant knelt beside one of the bodies, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck, though he already knew what he would find. 8, he murmured. 8 in less than a minute. His voice carried disbelief, not awe. War has a strange way of confusing admiration with fear, and the men looked at Thomas now, not with mockery, not even with simple respect, but with a kind of wary wonder. It was as if he had become something more than human in their eyes, an instrument of fate, guided by some invisible will. Thomas rose slowly, the rifle hanging in his hand like an extension of his body. He wiped the frost from its wooden stock, tracing his thumb over the small brass plate near the trigger guard, engraved with initials that had once belonged to his grandfather, J.A. Avery, 1917. The letters glimmered faintly in the cold light, as though the metal still remembered the trembling hands that had carved them long ago. He whispered the name under his breath, a private act of gratitude and mourning combined. The platoon gathered themselves, nerves still jangling, eyes darting between the trees for signs of another ambush. The sergeant gave the signal to move, his voice softer now, as if unwilling to disturb the solemn stillness that lingered after the violence. "We keep moving north," he said. "We can't stay here. If there's one patrol, there's more." Thomas fell in line, though he felt strangely separate from the men around him, as though he were walking in a different layer of the world. He could feel the rifle's weight on his shoulder, could hear the faint creak of the leather sling, could sense every heartbeat of the forest, but his mind was adrift, caught between the reality of survival and the surreal enormity of what had just occurred. 8 men, 8 human lives extinguished in the span of breaths. He had done what was necessary, but necessity didn't erase the echo of it. As they advanced, the world around them grew quieter, more distant. The snow had begun to fall again, heavier now, soft flakes spinning lazily through the air, erasing footprints and covering the dead. The forest seemed to be reclaiming what had been taken, its silence both merciful and cruel. They passed through thickets and shallow streams, frozen at the edges, their reflections distorted and broken. Every now and then, a far-off artillery boom reminded them that the war was still devouring the world beyond the woods. When night fell, they stopped near an abandoned farmhouse. The roof had collapsed on one side, and the windows were shattered, but it offered enough shelter from the wind. The men set up a small fire, its flame flickering against the broken walls. They ate in silence, the crackle of burning wood the only sound between them. The sergeant sat across from Thomas, studying him through the dim glow. "That rifle," he finally said. "It's a family piece, isn't it?" Thomas nodded. "My grandfather carried it in France," he said quietly. "Said it saved him more times than he could count." The sergeant leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Seems like it's doing the same for you." Thomas didn't answer. He stared into the fire instead, watching the sparks spiral upward, like lost souls searching for a way out. "He used to say the rifle remembers," Thomas murmured after a moment. "That every shot, every battle, leaves something behind in the wood. Not just the marks, but the weight of it, the memory." The sergeant gave a tired half smile. "If that's true, your rifle must be heavy as hell tonight." Thomas looked down at the weapon beside him. Its metal gleamed softly in the firelight, alive in a way that made him uneasy. "It is," he said, "heavier than I thought it could be." Outside, the wind rose, whistling through the empty windows like a distant lament. The men huddled closer to the fire, seeking warmth not just from the cold, but from the invisible chill that settled after every close encounter with death. Thomas lay awake long after the others had drifted into uneasy sleep, listening to the creak of the farmhouse and the faint rustle of the snow against the door. His hands ached from gripping the rifle too long, his muscles burned with fatigue, but it was his mind that refused to rest. He could see the faces of the men he had killed, not clearly, but as blurred outlines. Shadows burned into his consciousness. In the dark, he lifted the rifle once more, running his fingers along the barrel, whispering the same words his grandfather had taught him years ago. "Steady heart, steady hand, He didn't know if it was prayer or superstition anymore, perhaps both, but in that whisper there was both guilt and gratitude, both mourning and resolve. The rifle felt warm under his touch, as if it too breathed in rhythm with him. The fire died to embers, and Thomas closed his eyes, surrendering to the uneasy embrace of exhaustion. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the forest, softening the world again into silence. But deep within the woods, far beyond their circle of safety, other boots were already moving. Another SS patrol, drawn by the faint echo of gunfire carried on the wind. And as Thomas slept, his rifle rested beside him like a guardian, ancient and patient, waiting for the dawn and the next inevitable call to action. Dawn crept into the ruined farmhouse like a hesitant memory, soft and pale, filtering through the cracks in the broken walls. The world outside was wrapped in white silence, the kind that makes even breath feel like an intrusion. Thomas woke to that stillness, the kind that soldiers instinctively fear. It was too quiet, too perfect, the calm that never lasts. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, and immediately reached for the rifle that rested beside him, fingers brushing the familiar worn stock before he even opened his eyes fully. The others were still stirring, muttering in low voices, pulling on frozen boots and stamping warmth back into their feet. The sergeant stood by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of snow. His face was grave, his expression unreadable. "Tracks," he said without turning. "Fresh ones, maybe an hour old." The words landed like a physical blow. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, not from panic, but from that deep instinct of soldiers who know danger is already closing in. He joined the sergeant at the window, eyes narrowing against the glare of the snow. The tracks came from the east, a thin, deliberate trail winding through the forest. They weren't American. He could tell from the spacing, from the precision. SS. They were hunting. "We move," the sergeant said. "Now." The men obeyed without hesitation. They doused the fire, shouldered their weapons, and slipped into the cold. The wind had died, but the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. As they advanced through the trees, Thomas felt that same strange connection return, that sense of being both within the moment and outside it, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate him. He could hear the snow crunch under his boots, feel the slow rhythm of his breathing, taste the metallic tang of the air. Somewhere in that frozen stillness, he began to sense them, the unseen eyes of those approaching, the steady, methodical steps of a new patrol closing in. They reached a ridge overlooking a shallow valley where the snow lay unbroken and pure, except for a faint trail leading across its center. The sergeant signaled for the men to spread out, to take cover among the rocks and fallen logs. Thomas knelt behind a half-buried tree trunk, the rifle resting across his knees. The weapon felt heavier today, as if it, too, understood what was coming. Minutes passed, maybe more. The cold seeped through his gloves and into his bones, but he barely noticed. Then came the first sound, the faint clink of metal, followed by the crunch of boots. The SS patrol appeared like ghosts emerging from fog. A dozen men, disciplined and alert, their breath visible in the cold air. They moved cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning the tree line. Thomas counted them silently, lips moving without sound. 12. He could feel the others around him shifting, the tension vibrating through the forest like a drawn wire. The sergeant's hand went up, signaling them to hold. The plan was to let the patrol pass, to avoid engagement if possible. They were too deep, too exposed. But fate is not bound by plans. One of the Germans stopped suddenly. His gaze snapped to a patch of snow near where one of the Americans had knelt moments before, leaving the faint imprint of a boot heel. He shouted something, sharp, guttural, and in an instant, rifles swung toward the ridge. The forest exploded. Gunfire tore through the morning, shredding the quiet into chaos. The Americans returned fire, muzzle flashes strobing through the fog. Men shouted, ducked, fell. Snow erupted into plumes around them as bullets struck the ground. Thomas slid into position, the old rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. The sound of automatic fire roared in his ears, but he found the calm center again, that narrow space where noise faded and instinct ruled. He exhaled once, aimed, fired, a clean hit. One man down. The bolt cycled with a practiced motion, smooth, efficient. Another shot, another fall. To the men around him it was unreal how, amid the storm of chaos, Thomas seemed untouched, his every movement deliberate, unhurried. The rifle cracked like a heartbeat, steady and unbroken, answering the rapid chatter of the enemy's weapons with ancient, patient precision. The SS tried to flank, but Thomas saw them first, the faint shift of shadow against white, and his next shot found its mark before the man even raised his gun. But they kept coming. The air filled with the hiss of bullets and the screams of the wounded. The sergeant shouted orders, "Pull back, regroup," but the line was collapsing. Thomas stayed behind, covering their retreat. He moved between trees, firing, reloading, firing again, every motion fluid, mechanical, inevitable. The rifle was an extension of his breath now, and the forest echoed with its rhythm. When the last of his comrades disappeared into the trees, Thomas fell back too, ducking low, his boots slipping in the churned snow. The SS were relentless. Their leader barked orders, his voice sharp with fury. Thomas turned, fired, and the man fell backward, a red stain blooming across his chest. Another shot, another scream. The echoes tangled with the wind. Finally, the forest was still again. The gunfire faded into memory, leaving only the sound of snow dripping from branches, the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. Thomas leaned against a tree, chest heaving, eyes unfocused. His rifle hung at his side, the barrel smoking faintly. The sergeant appeared, his face pale beneath a layer of soot and frost. "You covered us," he said. "You saved us again." Thomas didn't respond. He just nodded once, staring out into the emptiness where the enemy had been moments before. His hands were trembling now, and for the first time, he realized they weren't from the He looked down at the rifle, its stock cracked slightly near the butt, a small splinter missing from the recoil. He ran his thumb along it, feeling the rough edge. The weapon was old, but it still lived. It had survived another battle, just as it had survived his grandfather's war. Thomas whispered, barely audible, "Not yet. We're not done yet." "Ort." And the forest, silent and watchful, seemed to whisper back. Night descended like a slow funeral over the forest. The trees stood black against the pale snow, their skeletal branches trembling in the wind, as if whispering to one another about the things they had seen. Thomas sat alone near the embers of a dying fire, the rifle resting across his knees, the last faint glow of orange light glinting off its barrel. The others slept in scattered silence, wrapped in torn blankets and exhaustion. No one had spoken much since the ambush. The dead weighed heavy on all of them, those they had lost, those they had taken. But Thomas felt the weight more acutely than anyone. Every crackle of the fire sounded like a gunshot. Every sigh of wind carried the echo of the men who had fallen beneath his aim. He leaned back against the trunk of a tree, staring up at the stars barely visible through the drifting smoke. Somewhere in the distance, artillery murmured, a low rhythmic thunder that rolled over the hills like an approaching storm. War was always there, like a heartbeat in the distance, steady and merciless. He remembered his grandfather's stories again, told in the amber light of a kitchen lamp when Thomas was a boy too young to understand the meaning of fear. "It doesn't matter how good your rifle is," the old man had said, his voice raspy from the years. "The question is whether you can still be human after you've used it." Thomas had never understood that until now. He looked at his hands, the faint tremor still running through them, the grime and blood caked into the lines of his skin. He flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the ache deep in the tendon. The rifle beside him gleamed dully, its old steel still warm from battle. He reached for a rag and began cleaning it with deliberate care, the same ritual he performed every night. He wiped away the soot, the residue, the ghosts. But no matter how many times he ran the cloth along the barrel, he couldn't clean away what lingered in his mind. The sergeant approached quietly, sitting down beside him without speaking. For a while, they just listened to the fire breathe. Finally, the sergeant said, "We sent a runner east this morning. Command knows we're still alive. They'll move us out tomorrow." Thomas nodded, not lifting his eyes. "How many made it?" The sergeant's jaw tightened. 8 out of 15. Silence again. Thomas swallowed hard. He had thought the number would be worse, but somehow 8 still felt unbearable. 8 men breathing because 8 others no longer could. Balance, fate, symmetry, whatever one called it. War always demanded its pound of flesh. After a long pause, the sergeant spoke again, softer now. "You did good, Avery. Don't let anyone tell you different. You saved us out there." Thomas's gaze flicked toward the rifle. "I don't know if that's good," he said quietly. "Feels like the more I save, the less of me there's left." The sergeant said nothing. There was nothing to say. He stood after a while, his boots crunching softly in the snow, and left Thomas alone with his thoughts. The night deepened, the forest sighed. Somewhere an owl called, low and distant. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion wrap around him like a blanket. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it came in fragments, broken images, his grandfather's face flickering between bursts of gunfire, the trench mud of 1917 dissolving into the frozen white of 1940. The rifle bridged both visions, timeless. endless, its bolts sliding back and forth like the turning of history itself. He woke before dawn, startled by a noise that only soldiers notice, the almost imperceptible crunch of snow under cautious feet. He froze, eyes snapping open, and reached instinctively for the rifle. The fire had died completely, and the camp was wrapped in grey pre-dawn haze. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate, not animal, human. He crawled toward the nearest log, heart pounding, scanning the tree line. At first, he saw nothing, then movement, a shadow between the trees, one figure, then another, then 5. Their outlines were unmistakable. SS. He hissed under his breath. Up! Get up! The men stirred, confused, fumbling for weapons. The forest erupted in chaos once more. Bullets tore through the air, splintering bark and sending showers of snow cascading down. Thomas fired before he could think, the rifle cracking with the sharp precision of instinct. A man dropped, then another. The sergeant shouted for cover, his voice nearly drowned by the roar of machine guns. Thomas moved along the tree line, low, fast, methodical. He fired, cycled the bolt, fired again. Every shot found its place, every breath controlled, but they were outnumbered, badly. The SS advanced through the fog like spectres, their black coats blending into the grey. The Americans fell back toward the ridge, firing blindly, desperate to break the encirclement. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Thomas's jacket, grazing his arm. He barely felt it. He reloaded, chambered another round, and kept shooting. 1 shot, 2, 3. The world had narrowed again to that single rhythm of fire and motion, of survival and duty. When the smoke cleared at last, only silence remained. Bodies lay scattered among the snow, dark stains spreading beneath them like ink on parchment. The wind carried the acrid scent of burned powder and something else, something human. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly. His breath came in ragged bursts, and for a moment he thought his knees might give way. The sergeant was shouting orders, counting heads, dragging the wounded to cover. Thomas just stood there, staring at the rifle in his hands. The stock was cracked deeper now, the old wood splitting along a fault line that had probably been forming for years, a piece of the past, breaking apart under the strain of the present. He touched it gently, like one might touch the face of the dying. "Hold on," he whispered, "just a little longer." And though the wind swallowed the words, it felt as if the rifle heard him. He slung it across his shoulder and turned toward the others. They had survived again, but the forest still waited, endless, indifferent, a cathedral of silence and snow that knew how small men truly were beneath its branches. The snow was red now, streaked with the residue of battle and the slow seep of lives lost to the indifferent soil. Thomas moved through it like a ghost, rifle in hand, boots sinking into the half-frozen ground with dull, hollow thuds. The forest no longer felt like a place. It was a wound, deep and pulsing, filled with the echoes of those who had passed through it. The light had faded into a perpetual twilight that distorted colour and distance, where everything seemed both close and unreachable. The men walked in silence, their faces ashen, their movements mechanical. They had long since stopped speaking about home, about food, about the future. Only the next step mattered, only the next breath. They had been ordered to reach a ridge overlooking the river Meuse, where the remnants of their division were said to be regrouping. But between them and that fragile hope stretched 15 miles of hostile territory, forests crawling with patrols, roads mined and watched. Each sound that broke the stillness could mean death. Thomas's senses were raw from it. Every crack of ice, every rustle of branch was magnified until it seemed to fill the world. Yet beneath the tension, there was a strange calm growing in him, the steadying of a man who had passed beyond fear into something colder, harder. The rifle hung from his shoulder, its cracked stock bound with a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve. It no longer gleamed. It looked ancient, almost primitive, but in Thomas's grip, it remained alive. The others still glanced at it from time to time, with a mixture of awe and superstition, as though it were not a weapon, but a talisman. They no longer mocked it. Some of them even whispered small prayers when he lifted it, as though divine intervention might pass through the metal and wood of that relic. By noon they reached the edge of a clearing. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, thin, grey, curling through the treetops. The sergeant signalled a halt. They crouched, scanning the horizon through binoculars. Thomas could see the faint outlines of movement, black uniform, the glint of helmets. Another SS encampment, positioned along the road that led to the ridge. Between them and salvation stood at least 20 men, perhaps more. The sergeant cursed softly. "We can't go around," he said. "We're running out of light. We hit them fast, from the trees, before they know what's coming." The plan was madness, but madness was all they had left. The men nodded, too tired to protest. Thomas checked his ammunition. 7 rounds left, 7 bullets for 20 men. His thumb brushed the cool brass of the cartridges, counting them like beads in a rosary. When he loaded the rifle again, it felt like a prayer more than preparation. They moved into position as the shadows lengthened. The forest closed around them, the branches whispering overhead. Thomas could hear the faint laughter of the SS from below, the careless ease of men who believed themselves safe. He steadied his breath, kneeling behind a fallen tree. The rifle braced against the rough bark. The old weapon's sights lined perfectly with the enemy campfire below, where a soldier sat smoking, oblivious to the eyes upon him. He exhaled once, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder. The soldier dropped instantly, the cigarette tumbling from his lips into the snow. The camp exploded into motion. Shouts, confusion, the scrambling of boots. Thomas cycled the bolt and fired again. Another man fell. The forest erupted with the answering storm of return fire. Bullets tore through branches, sending splinters flying, thudding into the trees around him. The Americans advanced through the chaos, their shots mingling with the hiss of the wind. Thomas moved with them, a steady presence in the blur of combat. Each pull of the trigger felt slower, heavier, but more precise, as if time stretched to accommodate the rhythm of his hands. He hit a man reloading behind a crate, then another who rose to throw a grenade. The rifle spoke its old solemn language, each shot ringing with purpose. Then the rifle jammed, the bolt stuck halfway back, frozen with grit and powder. Thomas tried to force it, but the weapon resisted, groaning in protest. He ducked behind a log as bullets shredded the snow around him. His heart pounded, breath ragged. For a moment, he felt naked, stripped of the one thing that had tethered him to survival, to history, to meaning. He tore the bolt free with a grunt, cleared the chamber, and slammed it forward again. The weapon responded with a sharp click, alive once more. He rose, sighted, fired, and the last SS officer fell backward, his weapon clattering uselessly from his hands. Silence again. The forest, breathing. The men stood amid the smoke, disbelief etched into their faces. The sergeant looked at Thomas, his expression unreadable. "That old thing of yours," he said finally, voice breaking with relief. "It just won us the ridge." Thomas looked down at the rifle, snow melting along its cracked surface. His arm throbbed from the recoil, his fingers numb, but he could still feel the faint hum of warmth through the wood. The rifle had survived once again, but it was near its end. He knew it. He could feel it. As the sun slipped below the trees, staining the snow in blood-red light, Thomas whispered into the cold, "Almost there, Grandpa. Almost home." The morning came softly, grey and hollow, carrying with it the thin sound of wind weaving through the dead trees. The forest was quiet again, but it was not peace. It was exhaustion, the silence that comes when everything that could be destroyed has already been broken. Thomas sat at the edge of the ridge, the river far below him like a sheet of dull silver, the sky low and heavy with snow. His uniform was torn, his face drawn and pale, his fingers raw from the cold. The rifle lay across his knees, cracked, scarred, its surface dark with soot and memory. Around him, the few who had survived the night rested in silence, each man lost in his own distant thoughts. The sergeant approached slowly, his limp more pronounced now, a strip of bandage around his arm. He stopped beside Thomas and looked out over the river. "Command says we did it," he said, his voice rasping. "They're moving up behind us. We held the line." Thomas didn't answer. His eyes were on the rifle, his thumb tracing the splintered grain where the stock had nearly split. "Held the line," he repeated softly, as though testing the words. They felt fragile in his mouth, meaningless against the vast emptiness before them. The sergeant crouched beside him. "You should be proud, Avery. You and that relic of yours. Never seen shooting like that in my life." Thomas smiled faintly, a tired, distant curve of his lip. "It's not me," he said. "It never was. This rifle, it remembers things I don't want to." He looked up toward the pale horizon, where the sky met the trees in a blur of white. "My grandfather carried it through France. He told me it saved him once. Maybe it did, but he never talked about what it cost him after. Now I understand why." The sergeant said nothing. The wind answered for him, sighing through the branches. Thomas stood slowly, the rifle still in his hands. He walked to the edge of the ridge, boots crunching softly against the crust of ice. The river moved below, slow and endless. He raised the weapon one last time, feeling its weight, heavier now, impossibly heavy, filled with all the echoes of the men it had taken, of the men it had saved. His fingers rested along the cracked stock, feeling the roughness where the engraving of his grandfather's initials was half worn away. J.A. Avery, 1917. 2 wars, 1 name, 1 unbroken line of blood and silence. Behind him, the other soldiers watched without speaking. They understood. Some things are sacred, not for what they are, but for what they have carried. Thomas exhaled, a long, trembling breath that seemed to leave with more than air. Then, gently, he placed the rifle on the snow. It looked small now, fragile even, as though it might crumble if touched. He stood over it for a long moment, then turned away. The sergeant called after him, "You're leaving it?" Thomas paused, his eyes still on the horizon. "It's done its part," he said. "If it keeps killing, it won't stop. Not ever. Let the forest have it. Let it rest." He began walking down toward the river, each step slower than the last, his silhouette fading into the white. The others watched him go until he disappeared among the trees. Then the snow began to fall again, soft, forgiving, endless, covering the footprints, covering the rifle until both were gone, hidden beneath the silence of winter. In time, soldiers from another unit would find that ridge. They would see the scattered remnants of the fight, the burned-out shells, the frozen stillness of what had been victory and loss intertwined. Among them, someone would find an old rifle half buried in the snow. They would pick it up, brush it off, feel the weight of it, and wonder who it had belonged to. And maybe, for just a moment, they would feel the faint hum of something living still inside the wood, something that had seen too much, yet somehow endured. For now, though, the forest held it close, as if protecting a secret it would never tell. If you felt Thomas's journey deep in your chest, the silence, the courage, the burden, leave a like and subscribe so more people can discover these forgotten stories from the war that shaped our world.